Good evening, everybody. Welcome to San Diego World Affairs Council's second event this month. It's our honor and pleasure to be hosting a special event for World Water Day, the Binational U.S.-Mexico Freshwater Crisis. Two of the three speakers are here this evening, Ted Kowalski and Larry Fanning. Unfortunately, due to several deaths in a family in this last week, Mr. Reyna is unable to be with us, and we send our condolences to him and to his family. So we're very sorry about that. Next slide, please. A reminder that next week, it's Thursday, this says Tuesday, but it's Thursday, March 29th. So, oh, sorry, this one does say Tuesday. Tuesday, March 29th, we're co-hosting Dr. Richard Haas, U.S. Foreign Policy Amid Global Crisis, along with, I believe it's 5 or 6 of the other California World Affairs Councils. I ask you all to please register for this event. First of all, I'm sure it's going to be an outstanding event. And second of all, this is the first formal collaboration of all of the California World Affairs Councils minus San Francisco. San Francisco was, of course, asked to join, but I guess they had so many chapters that they didn't want to add another one. So please register for this because we want to, not only do we want to attend this to hear Richard Haas, but we want to send a positive signal to the other World Affairs Councils that having collaborations like this, are valuable. We do cost sharing when we do this. We can do cost sharing when we're back to in person, and by having so many World Affairs Councils collaborating, our participant rate goes way up, and so we have an opportunity to invite more high-profile speakers as well. Next slide, please. And then for April 5th on Tuesday from 12 to 1:30. So we're experimenting by not having everything in the evening. So April 5th, Tuesday from 12 to 1:30, we're very pleased to be hosting Corinne Goria to be talking about social justice. She's written this book, Invisible Hands, Voices from the Global Economy, which she co-authored with a few others. And their interviews from around the world talking about social justice. We're also delighted that that format is going to be an interview format, and her interviewer is going to be Sahar Kalantar, an Iranian-American U.S. University of San Diego graduate student. So someone who has firsthand experience with issues of social justice in her own country. Next slide, please. If you enjoy our work, please consider joining us as a member or as a sponsor. We welcome you, and it's important to us to grow the organization. So please consider being a member. So with that, we're going to move on into the program. Joe, maybe put the first slide back on for a second, if you can. Otherwise, for this evening's event, one of our fairly new board members, Paul Martilla, who has joined us, took the initiative to put together the program for this evening, and a big shout out to him. A lot of work and a lot of time to do that, and we appreciate it. Since we have not been in person yet, our members maybe don't know Paul Martilla. So because he's going to be taking the lead for the rest of this event, I wanted to introduce him a little bit as well. So a recent newcomer to San Diego, Paul Martilla joined the SDWAC board last year. His current position is VP of Global Business and Strategic Initiatives for the San Diego Association of Realtors. Paul spent roughly half his career in economic development, working to attract and expand corporate investment in 4 American states which he represented. In his private sector career, he's been a consulting partner and a tax partner at 2 of the world's largest professional services firms. In these and other roles, Paul's focus was on advising corporations about the optimal locations worldwide for various types of business operations. For example, manufacturing facilities, call centers, headquarters, offices, etc. In nearly all of his projects, he has evaluated a wide range of business location factors, including the critical role of sufficient utility capacity, such as electricity, and notably in connection with tonight's program, adequate water supply. Insufficient water hinders business investment and growth, and as a consequence, limits job creation. Paul was an expatriate in 3 countries for a total of 14 years. To date, he's conducted business in 45 countries on 5 continents. As a disclaimer, the company for which Paul now works holds a minority interest in the New Water Group, LLC, from whose principal owner and chief scientist we will hear a little bit later tonight. It's not a problem at all, but we did want to mention that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Paul. So you're on, Paul. Thank you.
Christine, thank you very much for that warm introduction. And it's been my absolute pleasure to work on putting together this program for the San Diego World Affairs Council, which has also been promoted by World Affairs Councils and similar organizations in Arizona, other places in California, Nevada, and in Mexico as well. So I'm just going to basically set the stage for the issue. So this needs to be on the screen. Okay, so already the Southwest US and Mexico border region faces severe water shortages, already causing severe problems, including to the environment, animal habitat, also large swaths of formerly productive agricultural land have now gone fallow. Economic development, as Christina mentioned, because businesses cannot invest and expand where they have an uncertain water supply. And there have even been bad effects on human health. And unless something is done on a really major scale, things will get much worse and very quickly, because water sources will come under ever greater pressure as the population increases and the supply is dwindling. In the photo in the upper right, you'll see Lake Mead, which sits above the Hoover Dam. I'm sure many of you have been there. And you see here what we call a sort of a bathtub ring, where the rock is much lighter. I mean, it's difficult to tell because of the scale, but that is 166 feet below what its previous level had been. So Lake Mead is the reservoir capacity is way down after historic levels. If you look at the photo bottom right, that's the Laguna Salada in Mexico, and that had been fed for probably hundreds, if not more years by the Colorado River. But as you can see, in the last 35 years, that water flow has stopped and the lake has dried up completely. Now, this is very much an international issue, as Christine mentioned. There was a treaty signed between the US and Mexico in 1944. It was called the Utilization of Waters of the Colorado and Tijuana Rivers and of the Rio Grande. It was a treaty that was considered really fair by both parties. It covers all of the border rivers, and I should note, just surface water, not groundwater. And the treaty created sort of sister organizations, two sides of the same coin, as it were. IBWC, which is the International Boundary and Water Commission, and SILA, which is Comisión Internacional de Límites y Aguas, and a dispute resolution framework. And so all disputes since 1944 have been handled peacefully between the parties via these agreements, which are known as minutes. Regarding the Colorado River specifically, it's the water is allocated among 7 states, and Mexico also is allocated approximately 10% of the volume. The water, Colorado River water, by the time it reaches Mexico, is of a relatively poor quality, and that's important. Unfortunately, the agreement did not address water quality. By the time it gets there, it is so salt laden that is literally deadly to all agriculture there. And frankly, these years, the Colorado River does not reach its historic mouth in the Gulf of California. In terms of the latest minute, that's 323, they did set up a new water sources projects working group to identify possible ways of augmenting supply, so creating new fresh water. And we're expecting to see a request for proposal from IBWC and SELA, perhaps sometimes this calendar year. So the challenge facing our binational region, I think it's fair to say that the Colorado River is over allocated and it's undervalued. We in Southern California are a little bit insulated, or we don't feel the effects of it so much because of favorable water transfer agreements that Southern California had negotiated in recent decades. But certainly other surrounding states have suffered cutbacks. So resulting in, actually, there was a federal, US federal water shortage declaration for the first time in history last year, and that resulted in 10% cutbacks to the states of Nevada, Arizona, and also to Mexico. As I mentioned before, Lake Mead is way down. It's at 35% of capacity because as the Colorado River's natural flows from snowpack decline, they're making up the volume by releasing water from the reservoirs. Lake Powell, the other main reservoir on the Colorado River, is at 24% capacity. It's only 2 feet above a critical level where it's actually possible that the hydroelectric generation capacity may be lost. There's a 30% chance that it will be lost already next year in 2023. There are dwindling groundwater reserves. Alternative supplies have not been identified, and a lot of the conveyance systems, canals and pipes, etc., are old and leaking, so a lot of water is lost to that. There is certainly a potential for conflict between users of water in both countries, and in fact, there was a small skirmish in 2020-21 over some groundwater supplies. And as I mentioned before, the river no longer reaches the Colorado River, and that has caused a real degradation of the Mexicali Valley and the Colorado River Delta. So climate change is making it all worse. We are now in a mega drought. It started at least 20 years ago, and scientists say that it's the worst one we've had in 20 years, and 1,200 years. And that has two main effects. So it decreases the snowpack, which is what gives us the Colorado River flow, and also the evaporation goes up the hotter it is, and a tremendous amount of water, Colorado River water, is lost to evaporation. So I want to just, before turning it over to Ted, just tell you some what I call terms of art, because water in the United States is measured in acre feet, and an acre foot is the amount of water required to cover an acre of ground 1 foot deep in water. That is equivalent to about 1.2 thousand cubic meters in Mexico, and 1 acre foot is 326,000 gallons. So think about it in terms of how many households or how much farmland can be served by that amount of water. So an acre foot typically can serve an average of 2 households, or 1/4 acre of land. So when you hear a term 1 million acre feet, so that's covering 2 million average households, and 250,000 acres of agricultural land. The annual flow of the Colorado River has ranged in recent years from between 13.5 and 16.5 million acre feet per year. And Mexico's allocation, again, is 1.5 million acre feet. So I think tonight we're going to hear speakers who are going to talk about conservation methods. We're going to hear from a speaker who's going to talk about augmentation, creating new freshwater supplies on a massive scale. But I think it's clear that we're going to need an all of the above approach, and it has to be conducted with the urgency that this situation requires. So I'd like now to introduce the next speaker, Ted Kowalski. Ted is a Colorado River water management specialist, and he is currently the senior program officer for the Colorado River Initiative at the Walton Family Foundation. He's represented the state of Colorado's Water Conservation Board in negotiations with state, federal, and international bodies. He's testified before U.S. Congress and the Colorado General Assembly as an expert witness. And when he was in the Colorado Attorney General's office, he worked on water law issues. Ted, welcome. We're anxious to hear what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul and Christine, for inviting me to speak today to the San Diego World Affairs Council. I'm honored and privileged to talk a little bit about some of the work that I do on the Colorado River and about the challenges facing the Colorado River, which is really a microcosm for how many of the rivers across the world are going to have to deal with climate change in terms of droughts. We also work over on the Mississippi River Basin, where we deal with the countervailing set of problems around climate change and water in terms of flooding and land erosion. But March 22nd marks World Water Day, which is an annual United Nations observance that celebrates water and inspires global reflection on the importance of water in sustaining a healthy planet. And let me pull up my slides here in a second. And in celebration or in recognition of World Water Day, today the Walton Family Foundation, along with the Morning Consult, a polling organization, just released some poll results where it determined that Americans agree that climate change will alter important aspects of life in the United States. And the poll shows that 73% of Americans are worried about climate change and water security. Notably, Black and Hispanic voters expressed more concern about climate change impacts on the economy, health, and equality. And 1/4 of American voters believe that their state will not have enough water during their grandchildren's lifetime over the next 100 years. What we see here is that Americans understand that climate change is water change. And droughts, floods, wildfires, and big storms all make climate change very real for people. And voters are united in their call for solutions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years and some of the solutions that we think are favorable. By way of background, the Walton Family Foundation is a philanthropic organization that was set up by the Waltons, who started the Walmart stores many years ago. And we focus our philanthropic work on 3 areas: the home region, where we're helping support communities in the Arkansas, Mississippi Delta area, trying to improve the quality of life. We work on K-12 education, and trying to ensure that kids have an opportunity for education, a great education. And then in the environment, we focus on water, both freshwater and oceans, and trying to support healthy, sustainable water systems for the benefit of the environment, but also for the benefit of the communities that they support. And importantly, our approach in the context of this work is we fundamentally reject that it is a healthy environment or a healthy economy. We think that the two can go hand in hand, and we believe that conservation solutions that make economic sense will stand the test of time. And so we really focus our efforts on trying to develop those solutions, trying to develop solutions that bring people together, that are more collaborative, and that can support both healthy economies and healthy environments. To that end, we're speaking more directly on the collaborative approach. We believe that the people who are closest to the problems are really going to be closest to the solutions. And we work with businesses, we work with farmers and ranchers, we work with environmental groups, and really try to bring people together to help them understand and appreciate the problem, some of which I'll talk a little bit more about, but also to creatively work together to bring solutions and look for solutions. That it's not sort of one interest over another, but rather how we can really make the this whole be greater than the sum of its parts. So to that end, we work in, this is a map of the United States by hydrology, and we work on, in the environment area, we work both on the Mississippi River Basin, which is that large area in sort of pink, pretty obvious, the largest watershed of the country. And there we're working on water quality, trying to improve water quality by working with farmers and ranchers, changing the way that they apply nitrogen and other fertilizers so that they won't see necessarily that fertilizer be wasted if there's flooding or runoff, but rather that they can use more predictive approaches and tools to time their fertilization so that they're not just seeing that fertilizer being wasted and flowing down the river and ending up to worsen the dead pool in the Gulf of Mexico, but rather can we work with farmers and ranchers to apply fertilizer in different ways, to manage their properties in different ways. In the Colorado River Basin, which is this area in yellow, over to your left if you're looking at this screen, and we always talk about the Colorado River, it sort of punches above its weight in terms of the size of the river and what it supports. The Colorado River Basin supports and serves more than 40 million people. It has a $26 billion recreational economy. And yes, it is an over-allocated system, as Paul talked about just a few moments ago. It serves 4 million acres of agricultural land, really important agricultural land in terms of if you buy winter lettuce in the wintertime, pretty much anywhere within the United States, you're probably getting it from the Imperial Valley or the area of Yuma, Arizona. And that's where it's coming from. So it has really high value crops. It can grow crops at all, in California and Arizona throughout the entire year, but it has important agriculture throughout the basin, in the upper basin as well. Importantly, it serves to generate hydropower, and it also is part of some of the iconic parks and recreational areas that we all know, like the Grand Canyon. And part of what we're trying to do is ensure that our children and grandchildren will have a healthy, sustainable Colorado River Basin that they can enjoy and recognize, as well as have a healthy, sustainable economy that's been built up around this majestic, mighty river. So turning a little bit to the challenges, as Paul talked about, we are in what's referred to as a mega drought. This has been the longest, most devastating hydrologic period in thousands and thousands of years. And this is just the most recent map of the US Drought Monitor. You can see that much of the basin and much of the West is in extreme or exceptional drought. And it's not just this year that we've seen this drought, but rather it's been over these decades. And certainly we believe that climate change is a key factor in the context of the lower flows that we are seeing, and it's reflected in the reservoirs. Again, that Paul mentioned, and behind me in my virtual background is Lake Mead, when it was dozens of feet higher than it is today. But that bathtub ring you can see, it is Lake Mead and Lake Powell are the two largest reservoirs in the country. They are at their lowest levels since they have filled. in the 1950s and the 1930s, and they are dropping. And we are continuing to see hot, dry conditions, which increase the amount of evaporation, they increase the amount that consumptive use that crops need. And so a lot of what we focus on in the context of the Colorado River Basin ourselves with regard to solutions is how can we promote and incentivize water conservation? Things like crop switching. Could we be growing different crops that don't use as much water, but that have a higher value? And in Arizona, there's a lot of experimentation going on with a plant called guayuli, which is a rubber substitute. It uses 1/10 the amount of water that alfalfa or cotton use, but it's of high value, and Bridgestone right now is really experimenting and looking at whether they can use and how they could use this rubber substitute as an alternative. And they're thinking about it really in terms of sustainability, because there are countries, in Asia where they get all of their current sort of rubber inputs, and if they can have a different rubber substitute, then it sort of diversifies their supply chains. Hear a lot about supply chains these days, and it also, importantly, promotes sustainability within agriculture in Arizona to have sustainable agricultural crops being produced, and there's a value proposition to be had there. It's just a work in progress, but it's an example of how we can think smarter and better in terms of promoting water conservation and still having healthy agricultural economy. I put this slide up there just to give you a little bit of the history. In the United States, the law of the river, the Colorado River Compact, which was adopted back in 1922, 100 years ago this year, we were really in a historical high supply. In fact, they were so certain that we were going to see so much water in the Colorado River Basin that they had provisions where they were going to come back in the 1960s and figure out how to divide up the rest of the water. And of course, the water supply is a lot more variable. What we see with climate change in particular, and the increasing demands, we are at a time of limits. We are looking for ways to reduce our water use and to promote and encourage water conservation. And certain scientists today predict that we could see a river of 20 to 30% less water over the next 40 years. And so myself, who works in the context of the Colorado River Basin, but other water managers from the 7 basin states and the 2 basin states in Mexico, are currently actively participating about figuring out how we can manage the river to a lower supply. How can we do it by proportionate share as opposed to fixed amounts, like Paul talked about with California, for example, where they have the first priority. They don't have to take 1 drop of shortage unless Arizona and Nevada have been basically reduced to 0. And that's been eroded and downplayed over time, in an example I'll talk about in a second. But I think water managers are recognizing we have to be more creative, and we all are going to have to give to live in this more sustainable system. And this just tells the story in a slightly different format. It shows the 10-year rolling average and then the long-term average. And you can see that it's a downward trend, particularly if you look at the last 20 years. You can see that black line really is below average. The amount of allocated water is between 17.5 to 18.5 million, depending on different legal arguments. And we've seen over the last 20 years closer to about 12.3 million. And recent climate scientists reports suggest that we should really be planning for a river that's 11 or 10 million over a long-term sustainable period. So how do we take vested rights like agriculture in a system that was built up around water when water was plentiful, and make sure that everyone has enough to continue to survive and thrive? And what are those solutions we can explore together? So for the Walton Family Foundation, what we focus on primarily is things around innovation. Can we use technologies like there's a tool that we've been developing with Google and NASA and EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, that will use satellite imagery to be able to calculate what consumptive use crops are using at the field level scale on a real-time basis. And so it's a tool that can be used to basically encourage or incentivize water conservation practices, because you can use the satellite imagery to demonstrate that you've actually reduced uses, and then that conserved water could be used for municipal purposes or other purposes on a willing seller, willing buyer basis. We also promote innovative nature-based solutions, natural infrastructure, things like beaver dams and beaver dam analogs, as ways to create fire breaks, as ways to encourage natural distributed storage, things like groundwater, aquifer recharge, things like that. We definitely support things like reuse, and we're seeing some really creative things happen between California and Las Vegas, where they are building the largest reuse water plant in the world in LA, and it's partially being funded by Las Vegas, and they're going to, by exchange, allow Metropolitan, who provides water to LA and San Diego, to take less water from the Colorado River and get more water from the reuse plant, and then Las Vegas can take more water from the Colorado River. It's a really creative, innovative approach, and it's sort of built for solving some of the problems we're going to face. Importantly, we also focus on markets trying to increase the demand for sustainably produced goods and services, and we also work with farmers and ranchers to improve and increase the supply of sustainably produced goods. And that's the example I gave just a little while ago with guayuli, but there are other crops like heritage grains where they use a lot less water. And if we can help support the markets to drive towards heritage grains and things like that, then we'll have a more sustainable system and a healthy agricultural economy and protect flows in rivers. We also work primarily on policy. Importantly, for the Colorado River Basin, there are the rules of how we manage the reservoirs and the system are up for renegotiation in, right now. They expire in 2025. So we spend a lot of time working with Mexico, working with folks in the US to think about ways to manage the system better, to promote conservation, and also to include water for the health of rivers. And we support and promote policy champions. And finally, we support an ecosystem of support. We work with underrepresented communities like tribes, Hispanic organizations. We work with other foundations to increase leverage and encourage public leverage through things like the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which dedicated $8.3 billion to Western water problems and infrastructure. And then we also improve and focus on improving communications and helping people understand this issue and why they should care, and how do we drive towards positive solutions. Oops. So Paul mentioned just a few minutes ago the Minute 323, which was a minute that was adopted, and it was the last of several minutes, which minutes they're not quite amendments to the 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico, but rather they're interpretive documents. And they are called minutes because they sound like a minutes of a meeting. They refer to things that were agreed upon or how things are going to be interpreted going forward. And it really is historic. It started with Minute 318, and it's sort of the most, one of the most important minutes in the last several years. And that Minute 318 was the result of an earthquake that occurred over Easter weekend in Mexicali Valley. And Mexico had devastation occurring to its water infrastructure. And didn't have the immediate need for that water to be used for irrigation in Mexico. But there was no provision under the treaty or contemplated where they could store their water in the US reservoirs to take it later. And that Minute 318 sort of broke that barrier, and it really provided a win-win because Mexico didn't have a need for the water in that year, and they wanted to store it for future years. And the US reservoirs were dropping, and so US water entities were really pleased to have additional water stored in our reservoirs to increase head and provide water security. And there was really a trust built through that minute. You know, Mexico was worried, of course, how can we trust that the US will return that water that we are storing in US reservoirs? But it has proven to be super effective. And one key aspect of that minute and then Minute 323, which sort of building upon that and the other minutes, was including water for the environment, whereby Mexico released water first in 2014 under the Minute 318, Minute 319. And this is a picture of the Sea of Cortes and the Colorado River as it's just reaching the sea for the first time in decades. And it really was amazing. And it was heralded across the world as a creative and innovative approach to managing our rivers. And it's been translated into dozens and dozens of languages. There have been conferences in Korea and Brazil and Sweden talking about this, and people come up and say, how in the world did you do this? How did you include water for the environment and reconnect the river to the sea for the first time in decades? And it really is a story about trust and about trying things out and really people coming together. And importantly, philanthropy and environmental NGOs dedicated a lot of the money and water to allow this to occur. But it took trust between Mexico and the US and the Basin states and in both the US and Mexico to allow this to occur. And it's been replicated since. And this year where we are, this is the picture of the pulse flow as well. I should say, we thought that it would have environmental impacts and benefits, but I don't think anyone quite understood the social benefits in Mexico. The people came out and celebrated this river that a generation had never seen. In the town of San Luis Rio, Colorado, their namesake, they had never seen the Colorado River flow through their city. And they all came out and just celebrated the river. But that's what this picture is. But I wanted to mention that this year we also continued and increased and had an additional pulse flow in one of the driest years and after this 20-year mega drought, and recognize the importance of continuing to provide water for the environment in Mexico. And it really is an incredible example and one that I think we need to preserve and promote over the long term. And finally, I just wanted to re-emphasize that collaboration is key. And this is a picture of the Basin states and the federal government, US federal government, signing a drought contingency plan whereby they agree to lower water uses over time. Mexico really led the way in that conversation. They had said and recognized that the states were having these types of conversations. Mexico said, we want to put additional pressure on the US and the states to reduce your water uses. And if you agree to lower uses, we will proactively, and before you even sign that agreement, agree to lower uses. And you know, it was really a testament to Mexico's leadership and approach, and it ultimately worked. Since that time, we continue to see the reservoirs drop, and we need to be even more creative and take deeper cuts to be sure. And I understand our next speaker is going to talk a little bit about an additional solution in terms of augmentation or increasing the supplies within the basin, and I'll leave that to him to talk about. But here is my contact information, and I really appreciate your attention. Again, thank you for inviting me to speak on this World Water Day, and I look forward to the question and answer session and conversation session here in just a little bit. I'm gonna stop sharing. So am I handing this back to you, Paul?
Paul, yeah, Paul, you're on mute. There you go. Thank you, Ted. Excellent.
All right. Yes, Ted, thanks a million. Really appreciated that perspective. Do we have the slide with Larry Fanning's bio?
If not, I'll go into it.
Yeah. I don't know whether Ed has it, but anyway, Larry, you can elaborate, but I got a few bullet points here. So Larry has a lot of credentials, and to some of you engineers, I hope they have more significance than they do to me, a non-engineer, but he's designated PG, CEG, REPA, and QSD. So he is a hydrogeology and geotechnical expert. As mentioned before, principal and chief scientist for the New Water Group LLC. He's a subject matter expert for the state's Board of Registration for Geologists and Geophysicists. He has been appointed by the governor to the California Department of Conservation's Mining and Geology Board. He's performed a wide variety of environmental and water quality studies and has been an expert witness in scores of judicial proceedings. So Larry, please tell us about how we can help solve this problem by creating a lot of new fresh water.
Great.
Share screen.
Let's see, let me share screen here.
Probably that one.
Okay, I don't see my picture. Okay, there we go. First of all, thank you for having me here to talk about a real exciting program that we've developed. And I think that you'll see it merges very well with the previous speaker's talk. And I'd like to applaud Ted in his presentation. The efforts that have been provided by the Walton family and other conservationists are what have kept us from essentially going under up to this point. I think that as Ted had indicated, we're moving into a new time frame, and I think Paul had indicated that too, that actually this is a climate change issue that's been going on for some time, for literally 1 million or more years. And we just happen to be caught in one of the places where it goes from being fairly wet to fairly dry. And with that, we're going to have to adapt to it or we're going to perish. So with that, I'd like to introduce our program, which is the New Water Group's proprietary IRAP and SuperStep to help bring a new century of water management to the world and to California. I think that you'll see that our program is going to solve a lot of problems. It's going to produce a lot of water, and it's going to present opportunities that heretofore weren't available. So with that said, I'd like to get on with my presentation. So bear with me while I deal with the issues here. Am I doing something? 1 second, guys. Oh, there we go. Okay. So a little bit of background on me. Already heard, I have a lot of experience. I've spent my entire life around water, around geology, around soil and rocks. I don't have a lot of friends as a result of that, but I'm very experienced in the ways of the world. I'm a professional geologist, certified engineering geologist. I own a civil engineering company with my partner, Steve Strickler here. I've worked for Imperial Irrigation District. I've worked for the Bureau of Reclamation. I've worked for the Mexican government as a special consultant to them, a special expert in looking for solutions in Baja California for new water supplies. The Salton Trough and the Colorado River are two of the largest loves of my life. And the United States and Mexico, North America, another love of my life that I would like to see continue. So that's a little bit of background on me. I've been doing this a long time. Essentially, the upper picture here shows me working with Imperial Irrigation District and the Bureau of Reclamation during doing special studies, drilling out in the desert for water. I've got my boots on the ground and got muddy for decades. And the lower picture is with representatives of the Mexican government in Baja that we've had multiple meetings with. The problem, the need for water. The current problems, as the former speaker Ted had talked about, was the Colorado River system is drying up. We have climate change that's operating here. Lake Mead and Lake Powell are at historic lows, and this is projected to continue. Demand at the same time is increasing. Something that we haven't heard a lot about is salt damage. Salt damage is something that has been plaguing humankind since cultivation was started thousands and thousands of years ago. It perplexed the Egyptians, it perplexed the Aztecs, it's perplexed us, and it has damaged crops like nothing else in terrain. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because that's a big issue here. Environmental quality, environmental health is strongly degrading in the Salton Trough in the Colorado River Delta. And this is a very important aspect for the West United States, the Western North America, and the environmental aspects, in fact, of the entire Americas, North and South. The current measures that we have in place, demand management is where they're essentially compensated to not use water, and conservation efforts, which the former speaker Ted went into great detail to discuss. However, these two things are stopgaps. There's just simply not enough water, and there's going to be less of this resource and an increase in demand. That's a tough situation. So the obvious solution to move forward is we need more water. We need lots of fresh water. Little explanation of terms. I recognize that Paul was kind enough to set the stage for this. We bandy about a lot of terminology like acre feet and cubic meters and salinity and TDS. I have this up here. We'll come back to it later if we need to. Here's a little discussion of some recent readings of concern that came right off the Bureau's website. And essentially, there's this term, the deficit river, that the Colorado has been given informally, as though the Colorado is somehow responsible for not providing enough water. Simply what we have is a declining supply, and it meets an increasing demand. Of all these two tables here, which cover Lake Powell and Lake Mead, what's critical here is that Lake Powell's at 24%, Lake Mead is at 33%. The storage is falling. They're down in 1 year, 44 feet in Lake Powell and 21 plus feet in Lake Mead. And although I'm having trouble seeing this, of the 28 tracked reservoirs behind Lake Powell, they're at 62% of their capacity. Lake Powell, the rivers that feed those reservoirs are at 50% of their capacity. Everything's dropping. But don't let that be the end all. The Bureau, back in 2010 and before, did an official study on this. And they did a thorough dissection of the conditions that were present on the river and its supply. And they came to a firm conclusion that there's going to be large shortfalls between supply and demand. And that needs to be covered if we're going to continue moving forward. There's also the other aspects of the Colorado River system that really haven't been talked about. Although they're related to water, it's more of the hydroelectric benefits that come out of that. And that energy generated is something that people count on. Now, something that's interesting here is we look at the trends of Lake Mead over time, and we've seen from the last 20 years or so, 21 years, that if it wasn't for the conservation efforts and it wasn't for the Bureau's actions in borrowing from Lake Powell, Lake Mead would have fallen below what we call an event horizon, and bad things would happen. Essentially, at elevation 950 foot, the hydroelectric shuts off. At elevation 895 foot, it's a dead pool. And the definition of a dead pool is the lake is now below its lowest outlet, and it no longer has any downstream flow. So what we see here is that down here at the bottom, We got an elevation 1050. If we just go another 100 feet below that, we're in trouble. And it fell over 20 feet last year, and it's going to probably fall out again next year or more if we don't keep borrowing from Lake Powell. But Lake Powell's now running out of water. So not only are we having those problems upstream, but we have a whole variety of problems downstream that are due to a lack of flow. And essentially, there was a huge condition that changed from the natural conditions that were present in prehistory time, geologic time, and before the river was dammed. Before people were present, there was a trinity, if you would, between the river, between the Lake Cahuilla area of the Salton Sink, and the Northern Gulf of California. In fact, the Northern Gulf of California and the river and the valley have been fighting each other and working with each other for probably 2.5 million years. And eventually the river was enough at one point to fill in the ocean, push the ocean back to its current position from a position that was much further north up in Palm Springs. So what's happened in changing that is we no longer have 15 million acre feet of water flowing either into the Salton Sink or into the Gulf of California to keep salts flushed away and to keep things healthy and to provide new layers of silt and fertility. We have a metered amount of water, and that water is very limited. The water comes in, it goes into the canal systems at about right here down at Senator Wash and Imperial Dam. They divert 4 million acre feet or so of it into California. The rest of it joins the Walton water drainage out of the Gila River and goes into Mexico. Is essentially water that's reached about the limit of drinkability. It may have a TDS of 1,000. It may have added, in the past, it was higher than 1,500. The drinking water cutoff for desired water is 500, by the way. So what's happened over time, and you can kind of see the United States over here, nice and green. Over on Mexico, it's kind of brown and dying back. And that's because the river never even makes it to the ocean most of the time. And with the Colorado River, you got 1 ton of salt per acre foot that comes into here. So you have 1.5 million tons of salt a year that's building up in this zone. You also have the issues of the Salton Sea, the toxic playas. Since the QSA was implemented and there's no water available to maintain the sea's elevation, it's kind of run away with itself. It's currently at minus 238, has a salinity that's over twice that of the ocean. And it's being fed by drainage water coming from the Alamo River and raw sewage from the New River, among other things. So we got a real problem. Now, this is what's happening with the river. Essentially, the system is it comes in and it just doesn't make it to the ocean. So all that silt, all that salt, and all of that builds up in this Mexicali Valley area, and it's poisoned it over time. And just for reference here, we have the Salton Sea. We have the United States border with Mexico. We have the Colorado River coming down in here. We have the Gila River extension, which is the Walton drainage envelope that joins the Colorado River just before it enters Morales Dam and goes into Mexico. This dry gulch here is the Colorado River as it flows into, it spirals around on itself most of the time into lower Mexicali. Now, what have those effects been? Essentially, we've got poisoning that's happened everywhere. And this poison is largely related to salt. And these salts aren't necessarily like table salt. They're all the dissolved solids that were present in this water that never made it to where salt belongs, which is in the ocean. And this gold color here represents the saltation of this and the loss of use and loss of habitat and all that goes with it. Essentially, let's start off with what are some of the problems we're experiencing in Mexico and in Imperial. And this picture here says it all. Back in 1905, the Delta looked like this. This is a colorized picture. Now, it's a dry wasteland. You have the toxic playas of the Salton Sea and the dust plumes causing incredible respiratory diseases and problems that are well above the national and regional averages. All the birds have left, for example, and out of the 440 species of migratory birds in Southern and South and North America, 400 of those use the Salton Sea and Mexicali as its flyway. This is an example of some of the material that comes out into the New River and goes into the Salton Sea. This is raw blood from Zapatos. In this area here, where the Colorado River comes down into central Mexicali, you can see the transition where essentially all of this that was previously cropland has died back and salted back to a condition where it can no longer be farmed. The Colorado River further down in this area here no longer flows and has become a mud-cracked and salt-laden basin with the groundwater similarly salted out. And as we get down further towards the Gulf, we get into a condition that's incredibly salted out. And that's now, this was formerly the Delta and what we call an estuary system. And that estuary system serves as the cradle of life for all of the Gulf of California. That is no longer operating anywhere near in the capacity that it was when it was a freshwater or a brackish water feature. And the salt buildup is just incredible. So the answer to this is the IRAP. And after taking my whole career into account and working for decades in both the United States and Mexico, I invented the IRAP system, which is essentially the Integrated Water Resource Assessment and Action Program. And with this, we took a logical stance of looking at this, of how would you approach this problem if you couldn't fail? If money was no object, but the solution needed to be had. And what can we do to make this work in a way that uses natural processes and natural resources to their greatest extent and benefits all concerned? And with that, we came up with a system that resulted in identifying a set of comprehensive programs and means and methods that not only address the causation and not the symptoms, and also brings the Bureau of Reclamation and all the conservation efforts forward into the 21st century, arm in arm. So the backbone of the IRAP system, and to address this, is called the Super STEP. And the Super STEP evolved from the STEP from our 2017 submittal regarding solving the problems on the Salton Sea. And we realized that we could not only solve those problems, but we could solve a lot more with just expanding the program a little bit. The backbone of the system includes a series of intake wells. We have a healthy conveyance system, a desalination program, production of different types of waters for different types of reclamation uses. And importantly, we have a way of getting rid of salt. And it's all powered by green energy, the greenest form of energy you could ever hope to have. And so let's go through that program a little bit. The overall program. And essentially, we'll start down in the south with the intake system. And what we have is a series of well fields, which are represented by these blue dots. And each one of these may be representative of dozens of wells to hundreds of wells. And these wells can be shore-based vertical wells, they can be shore-based slant wells, they can be shallow offshore mounted wells, but all of them have the one thing in common, that they're not direct water intake. And as a result of that, we're mining sea groundwater, if you will, that is occurring naturally in sediments that were left from the ancient Colorado River system. And that our systems have such low entrance velocities for these things may be 30 or more feet below the bottom of the ocean in pervious sediments, that we don't even harm plankton with our intake. And this has a benefit selfishly for our program as well, because about 30% of the expense of maintaining a desalination plant is scale and sediment buildup. And we don't have that problem with this because it's naturally filtered through the ground. Oops, sorry. One more. So as we go through, and this is going to be conveyed up to this point through San Felipe as a single barrel 15-foot pipe, at which point it becomes a 2-barrel 15-foot diameter system and moves up to what we call the northern well field, which is in Salinas del Impec. This is a large wedge of salt marsh that's salted all the way through. And back in the days before the Colorado River, this was all lush and green, and now it's salted out. But we're going to take advantage of that. It's also a sediment platform that we can mine a lot of groundwater out of. So we're going to pick up from this point here, and it's going to become a 3-barrel 15-foot diameter line. Sorry. And we're going to continue in that direction until we get to, with our pipeline system, the 3-barrel 15-foot intake into what's called the Delta well fields. And the Delta well fields are going to pick up on all the salt-laden groundwater that's developed in the lower Mexicali Valley and in the area of Laguna Salada. So we're going to be picking up a lot of groundwater and mobilizing this salt into our wells. And then from there, we go as a 4-barrel 15-foot diameter system. We go to the main processing hub known as Cerro Preto. And at Cerro Preto, we're going to be doing most of our processing of the water in terms of desalination, filtration, and segregation and distribution. As a first step in our program, we're going to build what's called the Western Conveyance, and it's going to carry raw filtered seawater to the Salton Sea ultimately, to restore the Salton Sea to its working elevation of about -227. And doing that is going to drown the playas and solve the issues of the toxic dust and provide a stabilization for the envelope of the Salton Sea that can facilitate development and use. And the system is going to, with our system, we can deliver up to 1 million acre-feet per year to the Colorado, from our system, from our wells into the Salton Sea. And we can fill the Salton Sea back to its working elevation in under 5 years. So while this program is operating, the rest of the system is going to come online. And our system includes the processing hub at Cerro Preto, where we do all the desalination work. And we have the Western Conveyance service line. We have a central service line that serves Mexicali and serves the planted zapatos that'll correct the issues with the New River. Then we have the easterly service line that provides a large amount of water to the All-American Canal, the Coachella Canal, Morales Dam, and makes it available to Arizona. What's so special about Cerro Preto? In fact, what's so special about this area? One of the most fascinating aspects of this is that this area is underlain by what's called a spreading center. And there's a series of faults and openings in the crust that occur, a lot like what happens along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and other areas, except it's directly under here. And this opening has allowed the mantle of the earth to be exposed through the crust. And a large amount of heat, and this is a cross-section of that condition, a large amount of heat is directly now in contact with groundwater, entrapped groundwaters, ancient groundwaters that have been heated to very high temperatures as a result of this. This creates an almost infinite supply of energy. Right now, Cerro Preto is nameplate rated at about 7,500 megawatts. It's the largest field in Latin America and one of the largest fields in the world. One of its cousins of about the same size is the Salton Sea known geothermal reserves area. Essentially, this entire area is represented by the faults that are above or to the north of Cerro Preto. And there's a large set of spreading areas under it, but they're more diffuse. So there's not quite as much heat, but it's over a larger area. And by not much heat, we're talking temperatures that could be 900 degrees or more, 1,000 degrees when you get close to the mantle. So this hub that we're going to be using in here, we're going to revitalize that. And we're going to be putting that heat to work to generate both green electricity and green energy directly mined by heat pumps to drive the desalination and pumping process. As a result of that development, we're going to also develop a lot of free energy or clean energy, that green energy that's available to the Mexican people in Mexicali and to Imperial as well. Kind of an overview of the system. As we see here, the intake portion of it is we have our well groups to the south, our well groups to the north, our conveyance line, our processing hub at Cerro Preto, and then we have the westerly line, central line, and the eastern lines. The overall capacity of this system is upwards of 5 million acre feet per year of desalinated water. Now let's get to the other end of this.
Larry, can we
Yes.
wrap this up and move to the Q&A?
I will be done in just a minute, man. I'm sorry. Okay. The outlet portion of this, and it's going to go fast. So we have 2 offshore conveyances that will take this and outfalls and take it 25 miles offshore and dump it into what's called the Wagner Basin. The Wagner Basin is a deep depression over 350 feet deep that stair steps with other basins moving down into the Gulf that go into deeper and deeper water actually, and then exit into the Eastern Pacific. And the system works following these currents that are perennial in the Gulf of California to pick up the salinity after it's been blended and treated and brought to a condition of very near the surrounding water. It's discharged into these current streams, follows the deep currents out, and goes harmlessly out into the open ocean. The implementation of the program, we're gonna, Mead and Powell get to recharge, the Salton Sea is fixed. We now have, we're gonna be allowing 500,000 acre feet a year that's dedicated to habitat to ensure the Colorado River continues its way into the Northern Gulf. We're going to be restoring the estuary and the Delta. We're going to be restoring the Northern Gulf of California's food chain. There's going to be water for everybody. Mexicali and Imperial Valley are going to see socioeconomic and environmental health improvements like they couldn't dream of before. And we're going to have infrastructure and energy available to Northern Baja. And we're going to reclaim all the damaged land. The end goal, here we are. We're going to be providing like I said, 500,000 acre feet of water are going to come in here. We're going to have programs to pick up the salt, and here's what it's going to look like quickly. Essentially, as we restore flow, we clean up the salt in the sea and stabilize it. The new flows combined with the pumping efforts remove the salt damage and restore the hydration of the Mexicali Valley area, restore the Gulf to service. And here's our conclusions. So I'd like to open that up to questions or to close my account here, if you will. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this.
Thank you. I mean, I'm sort of absorbing. I was typing my own notes from all of this. So one of the questions that popped up in my mind, as well as some of our members, is who's funding this? Who's behind this? This is a huge project. So kind of who all is involved in this?
Well, it's going to be private and public partnership. That there's going to be, the Mexican government is going to be partners in this, and they're going to be in the lead. And it's their resources, and it's their time to be in charge. Who's going to pay for this? The United States. And this is largely going to come out of water sales for sale of water for potable water purposes to households. And that water may be selling anywhere from $1,000 to over $2,000 an acre foot, whatever the market will bear, but I'll tell you it'll bear it. And it is expensive, but it's comprehensive.
What's the time frame for this happening and, raising the funds and putting this all together in implementation?
Well, I'm hoping to shorten that as much as possible here with your help, with Ted's help, and with all the members here. We need all the help we can get. If we were to go into this tomorrow with approvals and funding, I think that within about 5 years, or less, we'd see water flowing into the Salton Sea, and shortly thereafter, we'd see fresh water flowing to serve our needs.
And what does it mean when you say with your help? What does that, to whom are you addressing it, and what does that help look like?
The help can vary from anything from you taking the time out to listen to me talk here today, to forming an allegiance with us and understanding how giving us buy-in on this, spreading the word about how important this is, how there is no other program like this that can provide this amount of water. And I'd like to also get the cooperation of the Pacific Institute, the Smithsonian, other environmental institutes. I'd love to get the cooperation of the Walton family involved in this to go arm in arm with their efforts and to bring our change into the 21st century. It's going to be anything and everything we can do to get the word out. But we're going to find ourselves in a position that we need to start sooner than later. And we don't have any more than a few years right now. So if you guys can help me figure this out and how we can move forward with it, I'd sure appreciate it.
So because of the complexities of all of that, and I'm sure the massive amounts of money that are needed, what role do you exists already for either federal U.S. federal government and or which state governments? Do you have buy-in from any of them at this point?
I'd like to leave that to Paul to provide that input, but I can say that we have support on both sides of the border.
Okay, Paul, did you want to answer that question?
Right. Well, we know that we need Mexico to do this work, and so the bulk of our promotional efforts have been geared to Mexico so far, and we've received really a rather good reception. And we intend to continue that program, but also, frankly speaking, we also need to figure out how to access some of the federal monies, including infrastructure.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah. When you speak, you need to speak closer to the microphone, I think. So hold on, there are a couple of related questions. Have you discussed with the Federal Commission for Electricity in Mexico, and what is their reaction?
Well, we have met with SILA, and we've met with the government officials in Baja California. We've actually also met with the president of Mexico. We have not met formally with the federales in terms of that portion of the program, but Paul, why don't you talk a little bit about what we've done in that?
Right. So we know that the CFE, that's the acronym in Mexico, they're the sort of the Federal Electricity Commission. So certainly we've had some discussions with them concerning using the geothermal fields in Cerro Prieto. And but again, we have more work to do, more meetings to have, but preliminary indications are quite positive.
Okay, one of our members is asking if we could get a briefing on what is needed in the next couple of months.
Funding for us to continue our studies and to continue our meetings and to push things forward. Funding to help us with this would really help.
Guidance to give.
And or guidance, introductions. But
And so in that regard, are you working with any universities? And if so, which ones?
no, we're not working with any universities right now.
Okay.
Other than we have met with CICESE in Mexico multiple times. and we have their buy-in. SDWAC is essentially the equivalent of Scripps Institute of Oceanography in Mexico.
Okay. Have you talked to our institute? No,
No,
here. Okay.
but we have talked with the California government at length, and we were shortlisted on the first round of RFIs for solving the Salton Sea problems, and we're in line to be shortlisted again in the current program.
Okay. And I don't know if some of these questions get to be, like proprietary, but is there a competition? Are you the only player doing this?
Well, we're the only player who's come forth with anything, and we actually have a provisional patent in place for the IRAP and the methodology involved. So that's all I can answer at this time.
Okay. All right. Let me run through some of these other questions. Did that. So are you trying to raise private equity to help pay for this project?
Yes.
Yes, that's what.
Well, a lot of it's going to come from other funding as well, and we're hoping that the United States government would want to participate in that, and we're working towards that. We have some very high-ranking representatives on our team who are connected to the federal and state government who are working, lobbying that on our behalf.
Okay. Question: is my understanding correct that water, the kicking off this dramatic restoration is being extracted from wells along Mexico East Coast? If so, what replaces the water extracted? Is there danger of land masses sinking?
I'll start from the back and move forward. No, there's no danger to anything with regard to hydrocollapse or compaction. The water is fed by the Pacific Ocean into the Gulf of California, and it feeds into sediments that are in contact with the ocean. So if you can imagine the sand on the beach extending off into the water, extending a well into that sand that's in contact with the ocean water, you'd be extracting water that was filtered through that sand as groundwater, sea groundwater, if you will.
What's the impact of the overall volume?
The impact on the volume extracted is a drop in the bucket, if that, when compared to the fact that the tide changes up to 15 feet in elevation in that part of the Gulf every day. So a large amount of water is flowing in and out of there anyway from the Pacific. There's no impact that was identified by SDWAC, and no impact that's been identified by SELA or any of the Mexican government officials that was of merit as far as the questions, concerns that were asked. And those are really valid concerns, especially with what happened in the Great Valley, the Central Valley, from pumping operations that lowered the ground 30 or more feet. Which is
So what happens if the 1980s flooding of the Salton Sea repeats due to climatic variability observed on tree rings recorded over thousands of years of changing climate?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can answer that. I mean, climate
Okay,
variability is absolutely something that we see in the future, to be sure, but overall, there's a downward trend. And if we were to see a very high year, knock on wood, that'd be fabulous, because we've got places to put that water, because you've got two of the largest reservoirs in the country that are at a third or quarter the way full. And so, we'd have to have multiple years of dramatically high water to, start to reach a problem or see a problem. But, right now we're praying for additional rain and snow, to be sure.
What is the total estimated cost of the project? Over how many years? Does it ever achieve a steady state?
The answer is yes, it will, and it should pay for itself through the sale of water. And at, let's say, $2,000 an acre foot, that's about $7.5 billion a year of revenue that comes into the system. And that ultimately, this is a system that is expected to be in service for 50 to 100 years. And I do expect it to pay for itself and then some.
And what's the total estimated cost of the
Could be
project?
between anywhere from $50 billion up.
Okay, let me see if I got all the questions. So I have there's a comment, and I hope it's not inappropriate because I don't know what it means exactly. Sorry if I'm saying something out of line. So WinWorks has the design, build, own, operate, and finance capacity. And that person.
I'm not prepared to share. I'm not prepared to share any of that here.
Okay, I don't know what that means. That person sent it with their phone number, so I'm unclear what that meant. Let's see if there's anything else. Okay, I don't think there are any more questions that are specifically related to your talks, but I have some questions as a former Foreign Service officer, Aggie somewhat in different parts of the world, and also a democracy officer. So, and this is SDWAC. So I'm interested in the cross-border sort of political dynamics and also the community dynamics. What are the relationships? Is this going to be anybody win, anybody lose, and at what cost? To what degree are the local Mexican citizens engaged in this enterprise, or would they be engaged in this enterprise, and therefore what voice do they have? And arguably the same thing on the American side, the local inhabitants of the land.
Paul, I'm going to lob that over to you.
Well, thank you.
It's wearing a tie.
I do appreciate that. Well, frankly speaking, we don't think that there should be any objections in principle to any of the activities. Now, there may be some private landowners who will want to charge for having the pipelines or canals transverse their property. But in terms of Mexico, again, this is a Mexico-centric project. Mexico has gotten the short end of the stick for a long, long time. And we're trying to create a situation where agriculture returns and where economic development can take root, which provides both direct and indirect employment benefits, rising wages, and with spin-off effects and so on. And in the US, also with the Salton Sea cleaning that up, there's a tremendous cry in that part of Imperial County for that particular problem to be solved, because as Larry alluded to earlier, the rates of cancer, lung cancer and asthma are astronomical. And if we're successful in burying the playas there, then that problem goes away. So I'm hard pressed to think of any stakeholders who would have any objections to this program.
So sorry, just a little bit of a devil's advocate, because I was an international development person. One of our lessons has been the importance of engaging local communities from the very beginning of your discussions. There are many times there are considerations that we don't think about if we're not really that local community. And of course, there are a lot of other reasons why it makes sense to engage the local populations. So I'm curious, to what degree have you done that? Is there a time frame? Do you realize how important that is to do? Arguably on both sides of the border, but I'm a little bit more interested in the Mexican side, in part because this is the International World Affairs Council.
Understood. Well, we know that people have been talking about solving the Salton Sea crisis for a couple of decades now. And there are some people who have spent a lot of time on the ground in Mexico talking to individual stakeholders. There are some indigenous tribes there who own land in the area. And we have Mexican nationals on our team, and we will be absolutely sure to engage as many people as we possibly can early on, because we don't want to go too far down the road just in order to run into some sort of unforeseen obstacle. So that is absolutely a big part of our plan, and we're very mindful of our responsibilities in that regard.
Right, and thank you for mentioning it. I thought about it, but I forgot to say that, which is, what is the role of the Native American community in this whole process as well? You've addressed it just now a bit, but do you have anything more to say about that?
Well,
Have they been, I mean, I know it's very important in the San Diego community. Is that something that's important with your organization and your outreach efforts?
it is. So is it Ejido? Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah. Kukapa. So yeah, they are substantial landowners there. But again, they've seen their farmlands absolutely destroyed over the decades. They hate to see that the Mexicali Valley, which was once a very lush river delta, is now dried up mud laden with salt. So and they know that there aren't going to be any companies moving in there or expanding operations and creating opportunities unless this problem gets resolved. So we know that there may be steps we need to take in order to secure their agreement with the program, and we're prepared to do that.
Okay, just my personal advice is, everybody who could possibly be a stakeholder should be people you talk to before you do anything, just because
Agreed.
there's so much that we don't think about.
Agreed.
Another question. Imperial Valley has the most senior water rights and the lowest water rates, and still have the lowest per capita income, highest foreclosure and unemployment rates. So how will this expensive water help the economy?
You want me to answer that, Paul?
Yes, please.
Well, the first thing it's going to do, by stabilizing the Salton Sea, it's going to make the area attractive to development again. Right now, with the Salton Sea being a complete unknown and a variable in terms of its waxing and waning, in terms of its salinity, in terms of all the unpleasant aspects of it that are operating now, we're going to stabilize the shoreline of the Salton Sea. We're going to stabilize its elevation, and that's going to attract a lot of development that's moving into that area from Indio anyway. The County of Riverside's general planning maps show that they're looking at millions of people potentially coming into that area over the next half a century or so. And they're going to need places to live. It's going to be in that environment. They're going to find that once we clean up the toxic dust, we clean up the Salton Sea, we have more available water. We're bringing in development, property values are increasing, industries coming to the area. When you have cheap energy, you've got abundant water, you've got access to warm water ports and freeways. It's just inevitable that industry will follow that. And I just also like to go back a little bit on your prior question in terms of the local area on the south side of the border with the Kukapa Indians and all. And we've made presentations on town hall level in Imperial County. And the Kukapa sent their representatives to hear our discussions on this. There's significant buy-in from them. And that when we started our IRAP issues in Mexico at Mexico's request. I was requested by the Mexican government officials to come there and look at the problems with them. We met with all sorts of people, all the way from the borderlands, all the way down to San Felipe and over across into Tijuana. And we met with a whole variety of different peoples. And what we saw was incredible poverty, incredible loss, incredible degradation, all of which can be reversed by bringing this water to bear. Now, are they necessarily going to be buying water at $2,000 an acre foot? Probably not, but it's going to be paid for by homeowners. That's not a problem. And in fact, that's not out of line with what they're paying for water now. 1 acre foot feeds 2 average households for a year. So $1,000 water bill per year is not out of line. and that money is going to be made available to the Mexican government, Baja California, and Imperial, all the stakeholders that are there. They're going to be shareholders in this. So they're going to have an interest.
And
Okay, and
that's something
who's
here.
who's your labor force? So again, what's my real question? To what degree will you bring Mexican expertise to the table, not just in your design phase, but in your actual building construction phase? Do they already have all the kind of expertise that you need? And if not, will you be building in a component of sort of on-the-job training, mentoring, partnering?
Oh, yes.
Anything like that at the local level?
Yes, and that was something I think Oscar was going to talk about. Unfortunately, he's not here today. And that we very much want Mexico to be in the driver's seat here. As Paul pointed out, they got the short end of the stick in the 1944 treaty. And that now it's their turn to drive the bus with their resources and their people in charge of how this is going to move forward. Yes, we see training programs. Yes, we're looking to implement Mexican labor to the highest degree that we can. Yes, we're going to be bringing in all the talent from Mexico we can. Mexican law requires that, and we're going to follow that. And they're going to be a primary partner, arm in arm with us.
Okay, but you did say in the beginning, and correct me if I'm wrong, but did you say in the beginning that this is primarily going to be funded by the United States?
Well, yes, I recognize Mexico doesn't have a lot of money.
Right.
And the United States, on the other hand, does. And that the funding that we need to do this has already been appropriated to study this. And America is the one with the water problem, and they have the money to solve it. So they want social justice. They want to bring things into the 21st century. They want to be global. Here's your opportunity to do that. And that's what we see.
What about any kind of parallel efforts internationally? So other countries, other parts of the world, for example, when I was in Iraq, many of the issues you're talking about here were prevalent in Iraq and their whole agriculture sector. So are there other countries, other parts of the world that are that have any kind of models that are similar where there's appropriate partnering, sharing of talking about innovation, sharing of innovation, for example?
Well, I think Paul can answer that somewhat, but I have a response as well.
I think you're watering to Iran,
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer that. I can tell you that Israel is regarded as the least and by the way, they discharge their brine into the Mediterranean, and it hasn't caused any problems at all with marine life. I want to circle back to this question about the price, though. So I think saying $2,000 an acre foot, that's really, really on the high side. We're being conservative because the biggest cost component is electricity. And as we're using geothermal electricity, that will drive the cost way down. In addition to that, there are new technologies being developed all the time to more effectively and efficiently desalinate water, not relying on the historical sort of reverse osmosis method. So it could very well be that the price is well under $1,000 an acre foot.
Okay, that's why I was interested with whom you were partnering and sharing innovative approaches. Any concern about recent earthquake swarms in the Gulf?
Yes, always.
Okay.
And this is a very highly seismic area. However, designing for seismic conditions is something I'm certified in, something that my company deals with on a daily basis. And I actually worked with the catastrophe teams and the emergency management agencies, along with the Bureau and IID in the 2010 earthquake that they had in El Mior, and witnessed firsthand some of the effects of those earthquakes. So yes, we're taking that into account.
I'm just curious, as a former scientist, this isn't my area of expertise. I'm just curious, is there anything you can tell us about what does that look like? How do you take into account earthquake movements?
Well, first, I'm kind of put on a former scientist. It's like saying a former Marine.
Yeah, I've been with the Marines. Yeah, there is no such thing.
There is no such thing. I mean, you're once a scientist, always one. But in terms of the faults, we have a lot of information. Those have been instrumented, and we just would design an account for that, like how they deal with major conveyances crossing faults here. And I will say that we had a 7.5 earthquake on the El Mayor, and there was no disruption to the All-American Canal or any of the other major canal systems. And they all remain operational.
Well, there was the earthquake back, back in 2012 that resulted in the Minute 318 that destroyed and devastated a lot of Mexico's canals. Doesn't mean they couldn't be built in a different way to potentially withstand such earthquakes, to be sure. But I did want to just connect it to that work between the US and Mexico with the CELA and IBWC, and maybe make a clarifying remark, which is the minutes between the US and Mexico. They have a variety of different things that we're working with across borders. So the environment is one key area that we're working on, and there's committees to look and explore how we can preserve and protect the environment of the Delta together between the US and Mexico. There's committees working on conservation and conservation projects, and we're supporting those as well. And there is a separate set of sections within those minutes that talk about augmentation, things like desal plants and projects like the one that my colleague was talking about. And I just want to clarify, like, this has not been a focus of our work, and we don't tend to focus on the augmentation or increasing of supplies. There's also big projects contemplated that bring water from the Mississippi River Basin into the Colorado River. And again, we don't get involved in those types of projects. Really, we're looking more at water conservation projects and environmental projects specifically. But I wish my colleagues all the best, in terms of this, because certainly it would solve a lot of problems. And, but it's not where we focus as a philanthropic organization.
As an outsider, though, and thank you to Paul for, I'm sure, his thoughtful consideration of bringing you plural together, because from my perspective, it's important to bring both of those mindsets. One is that the scientific and business mindset, and the other is the areas that you, Ted, have just outlined that are also absolutely critical. In my opinion, you can't have one without the other. We really need a convergence of all of that kind of thinking and all the different stakeholders, which is why I also, am interested in who all the stakeholders are, and who's at the table now and who isn't, and perhaps who should be. We do need to wrap this up. I think we have one or two more questions. I'd like to get to them. Would a change of administration concern you? I don't know if that means, I'm guessing that must mean Mexican administration. I don't know if it means American.
In my mind, yes and no. Of course, anytime you change an administration, now you have whole new sets of people to deal with and different objectives. But in this case, the objective from our perspective remains the same. We need more water. We need it now, and we have a method to get it.
Okay. I'm not. Oh, let me read this next comment, because it's related, and I have no horse in this race. So there's another comment. It's a great project, in my opinion. We should wait for a new administration in the Mexican government to have legal certainty and political will for this project to be successful. So I'm just adding that comment from someone. Someone else was going to comment. Paul, were you going to comment, or you're on
mute?
Yes. Well, actually, we think it's a very opportune time, because the government in the state of Baja just changed, about 6 months ago. So they have all new players there. They have a very dynamic young female governor who has a very experienced and dynamic economic development or commerce minister. And we know for sure that they are anxious to talk to us. So what implications there are at the federal government level, I'm not entirely sure what the president of Mexico's own views about this would be, but I do know that some high-ranking government officials with whom we have met are very much interested in proceeding with something along these lines.
Okay, I got a clarification. That was still a very interesting answer, so thank you for that. The question was intended to be, would a change in the American administration concern you?
Yes and no.
I will say incidentally, it has not made a difference at all with our relationship with Mexico in the minutes that have been in place. They were supported by the Bush administration. Those conversations were supported by the Obama administration. And minute 323, the latest one, was signed by the Trump administration. So the politics on the US side have not interfered with or reduced the trust that exists between the US and Mexico. Could it in the future? Potentially, but I think there's a very strong bonds and a large, deep reservoir of trust that exists between the US and Mexico right now.
Okay. Yeah, so as a border region, so you see this, am I hearing what you're all saying, that this strengthens the relationship between Mexico and the United States?
Yeah,
Is there
I think
it doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, water has traditionally united the US and Mexico in this context, at least in the Colorado River Basin. It's not quite the same story over in the Rio Grande and Rio Bravo situation. There's been a lot more consternation over there, but in the Colorado River Basin, water's been a uniting force.
If I could say one thing to you, Madam Speaker, you mentioned that you worked in Iran and Jordan and that part of the world. Iraq, sorry. That with Israel, part of the reason Israel continues to exist is because of their understandings of water and their prevalence in water. They bought sewage from the Palestinians to sell them water. They worked with the king of Jordan to help solve the issues in the Red Sea and to bring the Red Sea into play as a desalinating venture, that there is a definite uniting front for water.
Great, that's really interesting to know, thank you. So here's the last question I think that we have. Sacramento River Delta, like dikes and levees around the perimeter shallows of the Salton Sea you probably understand this better than I do, may retain freshwater inflows at a higher stable water level around the deep central salty basin of the Salton Sea. That would be a lot more natural and less costly.
I don't understand, but there was some discussion of a ringed lake in a lake at one point that was found to be horrendously expensive, and that the faults that underlay the Salton Sea would liquefy them in the first earthquake that came along. The answer is to fix the Salton Sea the way nature would fix it, which is to fill it back up where it belongs.
Okay. Any final comments from Ted and from Larry first? Do either of you have any final comments you want to make?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your attention. And, I'll double down on Larry's remarks about the water being the uniting force. I mean, Israel and Jordan have nothing, they can disagree on just about every single thing, but that largest desalination plant that they built together, they have never violated their agreements related to water. And I really think water is different, or can be different, to be sure.
Great, and there have been a couple of requests for the slides. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to have copies of the slides, and I guess they probably show up with the Zoom, but a few people I think were very interested technically, and so if that's okay, please send them over to me.
Sure.
So before I do the final, thank you all, goodbye. Paul, do you have any final comments that you'd like to make in addition to thank you very much for putting this whole evening event together.
Oh, that's been my pleasure, but I want to thank their deep expertise and their obvious commitment to resolving these problems. And I think together they've given us a really good 360-degree view of the problem and some solution sets that are available to us. Thanks again to the speakers.
Yeah, thank you. This is a hugely important, issue. Oh, I certainly didn't know much about it, and I think I'm better off for knowing at least this much, and we'll continue to do some more research and follow your events, and hopefully through Paul, I guess, we'll be able to literally track some of the technology and innovations that you use. So thank you, speakers. Thank you, Paul, for putting it together. Thank you to all of our members. Really appreciate hanging in there. Many of you hung in there late. So thanks so much for that.